September 2nd, 1898. A dusty plain outside Omdurman, Sudan. 52,000 warriors were charging across open ground toward a line of British soldiers crouched behind a thorn fence. They came with swords, spears, and faith in God. They believed they were invincible, blessed by the Mahdi himself. In 5 hours, 11,000 of them would be dead. The British lost 48 men. Among the soldiers watching this slaughter unfold was a 23-year-old cavalry officer who would one day save the free world from tyranny. His name was Winston Churchill, and what he witnessed that morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. This is the story of Omdurman, the most one-sided victory in British military history, the battle that avenged General Gordon's death, and the day a young cavalry officer rode in the last great charge of the British Army and survived to lead a nation through its darkest hour. Welcome to Britain's history. Today, we're diving into a battle that demonstrated the terrifying power of industrial warfare against traditional armies. Because Omdurman wasn't just about revenge for a fallen hero or expanding an empire. It was a glimpse of the future, the moment when machine guns, artillery, and disciplined firepower made courage and faith irrelevant on the battlefield. But before we get to that killing field, before we watch waves of brave men charge into walls of bullets, we need to understand what brought the British Army to Sudan. Because without knowing about General Gordon's death at Khartoum, the event that shocked Victorian Britain like nothing else, you can't appreciate why Omdurman mattered so much and why the British came not just to conquer, but to avenge. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Omdurman. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1885, to a tragedy that would define British policy in Sudan for 13 years. General Charles Gordon, one of the most famous soldiers in the British Empire, had been sent to Khartoum to evacuate Egyptian garrisons from Sudan as Islamic revolution swept the country. The Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad, who claimed to be the prophesied redeemer of Islam, had raised an army of devoted followers and conquered most of Sudan. Gordon was supposed to get out. Instead, Gordon stayed. Whether through stubbornness, a sense of duty, or a death wish that some historians have suggested, Gordon remained in Khartoum as the Mahdi's forces surrounded the city. For 10 months, he held out, sending desperate messages to London, pleading for relief. The British public demanded action. Queen Victoria herself intervened, urging the government to save Chinese Gordon, the hero who'd suppressed the Taiping Rebellion and fought across 3 continents. Prime Minister Gladstone delayed. He didn't want British troops entangled in Sudan. By the time a relief expedition was finally sent, it was too late. On January 26, 1885, the Mahdist forces stormed Khartoum. Gordon was killed on the steps of his palace, his head cut off and presented to the Mahdi as a trophy. The relief force arrived 2 days later, 2 days too late. Gordon's death electrified the British Empire. He was mourned more intensely than any other Englishman in the entire 19th century. Gladstone's government fell. The public demanded vengeance, but it would take 13 years before Britain was ready to take it. The Mahdi himself died just months after taking Khartoum, probably from typhus. His successor, the Khalifa Abdullah, ruled Sudan with an iron fist, creating an Islamic theocracy that controlled the territory Gordon had died defending. For over a decade, Sudan remained a closed, hostile state on Egypt's southern border, a threat to British interests in the Nile Valley, and a stain on British honor that many believed needed to be washed away in blood. By 1896, circumstances had changed. The French were expanding across Africa, and British strategists feared they might reach the Nile and threaten the crucial waterway that connected Egypt to its southern territories. Italy had suffered a devastating defeat at Adwa against Ethiopian forces, weakening European prestige in the region. And the British military had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Major General Herbert Kitchener was given command of the expedition to reconquer Sudan. Kitchener was methodical, meticulous, and utterly ruthless. He'd served in Sudan before, had witnessed the aftermath of Gordon's death, and had sworn to avenge him. Unlike previous expeditions that had failed in the harsh Sudanese terrain, Kitchener would not move until every detail was perfect. His secret weapon was logistics. Kitchener built a railway across the Nubian desert, laying track as his army advanced, ensuring a constant supply of food, water, ammunition, and reinforcements. Where previous commanders had struggled with supply lines stretching back to Egypt, Kitchener created a modern logistical network that could sustain a large army deep in hostile territory. It took 2 years, but by 1898, Kitchener's force, 8,200 British soldiers and 17,600 Egyptian and Sudanese troops, was ready for the final advance on Omdurman. Among those joining the expedition was Lieutenant Winston Churchill of the 4th Hussars, who had pulled every string available to get himself attached to the 21st Lancers for the campaign. Churchill was already a war correspondent as well as an officer, ambitious beyond measure, and determined to see action that would advance his career. He'd already fought on India's northwest frontier and had a journalist's eye for dramatic detail. Kitchener didn't want him. The general had heard of Churchill's reputation as an upstart and troublemaker, but Churchill's mother's connections overrode Kitchener's objections. By August 1898, Kitchener's army was approaching Omdurman, the Khalifa's capital across the Nile from the ruins of Khartoum. The Khalifa had gathered his entire army, approximately 52,000 warriors, for a decisive battle. These were the Ansar, the followers of the Mahdi, men who believed absolutely in their holy mission. They defeated Egyptian armies, killed Gordon, and ruled Sudan for 13 years. They had no doubt they would destroy Kitchener's infidels just as they destroyed everyone else. On September 1st, Kitchener's gunboats bombarded Omdurman, breaching the city walls and shelling the tomb of the Mahdi. The army established a defensive position at Egega, a few miles north of the city, with the Nile protecting their right flank. They built a zeriba, a thorn fence barrier, and positioned their artillery and Maxim guns with clear fields of fire across the open plain. Kitchener knew the Khalifa's army would attack. He wanted them to attack. Everything was prepared to receive them. On the morning of September 2nd, as dawn broke over the desert, the Khalifa's army emerged from behind the Kareri hills. They came in waves. First the Green Standard with perhaps 8,000 men, then the Black Flag Division, then wave after wave of warriors armed with swords, spears, and a scattering of outdated rifles captured from Egyptian garrisons years before. Their banners flew above dense formations stretching across the horizon. Their war cries echoed across the plain. Drums beat, horns sounded. It was one of the most magnificent and terrifying sights any soldier had ever witnessed. The Ansar were not a rabble. They were organized into divisions under experienced emirs, men who had conquered Sudan and held it for 13 years. Their courage was beyond question. These warriors had charged into Egyptian rifle fire before and won. They had besieged Khartoum and taken it. They had killed Gordon himself. They saw no reason why this day should be different. Churchill, watching from horseback with the 21st Lancers on a ridge overlooking the plain, described the scene in his book, The River War. The masses of warriors advancing in a solid mass nearly as long as our front and about 12 deep, their weapons glinting in the morning sun, their voices raised in praise of God and the Mahdi. The white robes of the warriors contrasted with the dark banners above them. They moved with the confidence of men who believed absolutely in their cause. They believed they were invincible. They believed God was on their side. What happened next was not a battle. It was a massacre. At around 6:45 a.m., the British artillery opened fire. Shells exploded among the densely packed formations, killing groups of 5 or 6 men with each blast. The Mahdists kept coming. At about 2,000 yards, the infantry began firing volleys with their Lee Metford rifles. The Maxim guns, each capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, added their hammering roar to the symphony of destruction. Thousands of bullets swept across the plain every second, creating a wall of lead that nothing could survive. Churchill watched the slaughter with a mixture of awe and horror. It was a matter of machinery, he wrote. The dervishes charged into the pitiless fire of modern weapons, falling by the hundreds, then the thousands. The warriors, who made it closest to the British line, died about 150 yards away. Not one reached the zareba. The first Mahdist attack was shattered in less than an hour. The plain before the British position was carpeted with bodies. White-robed figures sprawled in the dust, blood soaking into the sand. Some of the wounded tried to crawl toward the British lines, still determined to strike a blow for their faith. The Maxims cut them down. But Kitchener made a mistake. Believing the battle was effectively over, he ordered his army to advance toward Omdurman before the Khalifa's remaining forces could regroup. This exposed several brigades to attack from Mahdist reserves that hadn't yet engaged. General Hector MacDonald's Sudanese brigade suddenly found itself under assault from 15,000 warriors who had been hidden behind the Kareri hills. For a tense hour, MacDonald's brigade fought for survival, pivoting to face attacks from multiple directions, while Kitchener rushed reinforcements to support them. The discipline of the Egyptian and Sudanese soldiers, many of whom had personal scores to settle with the Khalifa's regime, held firm. The Maxims and artillery once again proved decisive. The second Mahdist attack was broken as thoroughly as the first. It was during this phase of the battle that the 21st Lancers made their famous charge, the last significant cavalry charge in British military history. Kitchener had ordered the Lancers to prevent the Mahdists from retreating into Omdurman. As they advanced, they spotted what appeared to be a few hundred warriors in their path. A thin line of riflemen who seemed to be covering the retreat of larger forces. The regiment's commander, Colonel Martin, saw an opportunity to win the battle honor his regiment had never earned. He ordered a charge. It was a near-fatal mistake. The Lancers crested a low rise and suddenly discovered a khor, a dry riverbed, packed with 2,500 Mahdist infantry hidden in the depression. There was no time to stop. The bugles had sounded the charge. The 400 Lancers crashed into a mass of warriors, nearly 10 times their number at full gallop. Churchill was in the thick of it. He'd chosen to carry a Mauser pistol rather than a sword because of an old shoulder injury, and that choice probably saved his life. As his horse plunged into the packed enemy ranks, he fired point-blank into the faces of warriors who grabbed at his reins, slashed at his legs, tried to pull him from his saddle. All around him, Lancers were being pulled from their horses and hacked to pieces. The clash was chaos. Horses screaming, men shouting, the crack of pistols and the thud of swords striking flesh. The entire clash lasted perhaps 2 minutes. The Lancers burst through the far side of the khor, leaving dozens of their comrades dead or wounded behind them. Of the 400 Lancers who charged, 70 were killed or wounded, nearly a fifth of the regiment. They'd achieved nothing strategically. The warriors they'd charged could have been destroyed with rifle fire at minimal cost. But the charge became legendary, the stuff of Victorian romance, celebrated in paintings and poems. Churchill's participation would become part of his personal mythology. By mid-morning, the battle was over. The Khalifa's army had been destroyed. The plain was covered with bodies, at least 10,000 dead, perhaps as many as 12,000, with thousands more wounded. Anglo-Egyptian casualties were 48 killed and 434 wounded. The disparity was almost beyond comprehension. For every British or Egyptian soldier who died, over 200 Mahdists had fallen. Churchill rode over the battlefield later that day, recording what he saw. Bodies lay in heaps where the artillery had caught them in groups. Nearer the Zariba, they were spread more evenly. One corpse every 10 yards where the rifle fire had begun to tell, then piled 2 and 3 deep where the full weight of fire had struck. The wounded crawled among the dead, leaving trails of blood in the dust. Some still lived, watching the victors pass with eyes that held neither hope nor fear. There was nothing dulce et decorum about the dervish dead, Churchill wrote. Nothing of the dignity of unconquerable manhood. All was filthy corruption. Yet these were as brave men as ever walked the earth. That evening, Kitchener's army entered Omdurman. The Khalifa's capital was a sprawling city of mud-brick houses, and somewhere within it, European prisoners who had been held captive for years waited for liberation. 2 days later, they crossed the Nile to Khartoum. Near the ruins of Gordon's palace, still bearing the scars of the assault 13 years before, a memorial service was held. The ceremony was deeply emotional. Officers and soldiers who had grown up on stories of Gordon's heroic stand gathered near the spot where he had died. The Union Jack was raised. Bugles sounded. Gordon's favorite hymn, "Abide with Me," was sung by men whose voices broke with emotion. Officers wept openly as they remembered the hero who died on these steps 13 years before. Kitchener himself, normally stoic and controlled, was seen to be visibly moved. Gordon was avenged at last. The disgrace of 1885 was washed away in blood. But what did Omdurman mean? For the British Empire, it was vindication, proof that modern military technology and professional soldiers could defeat any enemy, regardless of numbers or courage. Sudan was incorporated into the Anglo-Egyptian condominium that would rule it until 1956. Kitchener became a national hero, later serving as Secretary of State for War during World War I. For the Mahdist state, Omdurman was annihilation. The Khalifa escaped the battlefield, but was hunted down and killed the following year. The religious movement that had controlled Sudan for 13 years was extinguished. The brutal regime that had terrorized the population was replaced by colonial rule that would bring its own problems, but also railways, schools, and an end to the worst excesses of the Mahdist period. For Churchill, Omdurman was a formative experience. He saw what modern weapons could do to men who charged with courage, but without adequate firepower. He understood that war was becoming a matter of machinery, that bravery alone was no longer enough. This insight would shape his thinking through 2 world wars. The battle also demonstrated something uncomfortable, that the British would rediscover 16 years later in the trenches of France. Industrial warfare was slaughter. The same weapons that had mowed down Mahdist warriors at Omdurman would create the killing fields of the Somme and Passchendaele. From a Sudanese perspective, Omdurman was tragedy. Brave men destroyed by weapons they couldn't match. A cause defeated not through lack of courage, but through technological inferiority. The Mahdist warriors who charged the British lines were not fanatics or savages, despite how Victorian propaganda portrayed them. They were men fighting for their religion, their independence, their way of life. They lost because spears and swords cannot defeat machine guns, no matter how bravely wielded. Today, Omdurman is a major city in Sudan, part of the Greater Khartoum metropolitan area. The battlefield where 11,000 men died is now covered with buildings and streets. The Mahdi's tomb, which Kitchener had destroyed after the battle, has been rebuilt as a shrine. History is remembered differently on different sides of colonial divides, but the battle's significance extends beyond its immediate consequences. Omdurman was a preview of what industrial warfare would mean for the 20th century. The brave charge into machine gun fire, the staggering casualty ratios, the impersonal destruction of men by machinery, all of this would be repeated on a vastly larger scale in the wars to come. The young cavalry officer who survived the charge of the 21st Lancers would carry these lessons forward. 42 years after Omdurman, as German bombs fell on London, Winston Churchill drew on everything he'd learned about war, technology, and human courage to lead Britain through its darkest hour. Perhaps that's what makes Omdurman worth remembering, not just as a victory, not just as vengeance for Gordon, but as a moment when courage crashed against machinery and machinery won. The men who died on that dusty plain deserved better than to be mowed down by weapons they couldn't answer. Within a year of Omdurman, the Khalifa was dead and Sudan was pacified. Within 2 decades, the world would be at war, and the lessons of Omdurman would be written in blood across the fields of France. Within 40 years, Churchill would stand in Parliament and promise to fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, never surrendering. The road from that cavalry charge to that speech was longer than it seems. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the battles that changed the world, the moments when technology transformed warfare, the leaders whose early experiences shaped their destiny, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other battles shaped the modern world? The colonial campaigns that built empires, the forgotten victories that deserve to be remembered? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.